brachial plexus, and in order to visualize it more clearly, I'm going to cut the omohyoid close to the sternocleidomastoid and reflect it. I think I might need a T-pin to hold that in place. Or I can hold it with my finger. Okay, so now we can see, so the portion of the brachial plexus that's in the posterior triangle of the neck is called the supraclavicular portion of the brachial plexus because it's superior to the clavicle. And the part of the brachial plexus that you can see in the posterior triangle of the neck are the rami, which would be here, and the trunks, and then there are branches off of the rami and the trunks that we'll look at. So this is C5 ventral primary ramus. Here's C6 ventral primary ramus. There. Move that little artery out of the way. This is C7. And then down here, close to the first rib, C8 and T1. C8 and T1. So those are the ventral primary rami that contribute to forming the brachial plexus, C5, C6, C7, C8, and T1. And they're emerging in a space or a triangle between the anterior scalene muscle and the middle scalene muscle. That's called the interscalene interval or the interscalene triangle. So the borders of that triangle would be the anterior scalene, the middle scalene, and then the first rib. The first rib is going to be right down here. Also in that interscalene triangle is the subclavian artery. And here we can see the subclavian artery. I'm poking it with my probe. The subclavian artery is divided into three parts by the anterior scalene. So in the posterior triangle of the neck, we see the third part of the subclavian artery. The subclavian artery is going to change name after it passes the lateral border of the first rib to the axillary artery. There are branches off the subclavian artery that we can see in the posterior triangle of the neck, but we're going to use a different cadaver to show you those branches. So C5 and C6 come together to make the upper trunk. C7 continues, the ventral primary ramus of C7 continues as the middle trunk. Where does the middle trunk start and where does C7 end? I would use the guide of the upper trunk formation. So I'd say, about right here is where the middle trunk begins because that's about where the upper trunk is formed. There's C8 and T1 and they come together to make the lower trunk. So if I lift them up, you can see the lower trunk of the brachial plexus. It's that portion of the brachial plexus that's in close proximity to the rib. Let me see if I can tap on the rib. So I don't know if you can hear it since the microphone is up near my mouth. But the lower trunk of the brachial plexus is the portion of the plexus that's in closest proximity to the rib. So it's going to be more likely to be compressed in that interscalene triangle because it's right up against an unyielding or a relatively unyielding structure of the first rib, as is the artery. So notice the position of the artery to the lower trunk. The artery is anterior to the lower trunk of the brachial plexus. When I lifted up this inferior trunk, I could see the tendon of the middle scalene right there. Can you guys see that? Okay. Okay, so now let's look at the branches off of these rami and trunks. So here's the phrenic nerve, and C5 makes a contribution. So here's C5. So there is a contribution from C5 to the other rami that make up the phrenic nerve. So it's C3, C4, and C5 that form the phrenic nerve. And this is exactly how you want to see the phrenic nerve on your cadaver, is descending on the anterior surface of the anterior scalene. That phrenic nerve is going to go into the thoracic inlet and provide motor innervation for the diaphragm, and it provides afferent or sensory innervation for multiple structures. namely the pleura, part of the pleura. Okay. If we look deeply here in the posterior triangle of the neck, we can see the dorsal scapular nerve, and the dorsal scapular nerve is coming through the middle scalene here, and that is a potential site of entrapment of the dorsal scapular nerve is within the middle scalene, and it's going to innervate the levator scapulae, which we can see right here, and the rhomboids major and minor. Next here is the long thoracic, and it is piercing the middle scalene as well. And the long thoracic is going to descend into the axilla on the lateral border of the thorax and innervate the serratus anterior. So that's the long thoracic nerve. That's a really nice dissection. Long thoracic nerve comes from ventral primary rami of C5, C6, and C7. Dorsal scapular is primarily C5. It can have some contribution from C4. So dorsal scapular, long thoracic. Here's suprascapular nerve, and that's coming off the upper trunk of the brachial plexus. There's the upper trunk of the brachial plexus formed by C5 and C6. So there's suprascapular nerve that contains contributions from C5 and C6, and it's going to head for the suprascapular notch and innervate the supraspinatus and the infraspinatus. So that's the suprascapular nerve. So we've got phrenic, a C5 contribution here to the phrenic. Phrenic is C3, C4, and C5. Dorsal scapular, which is from the C5 ventral primary ramus. Long thoracic, which is from C5, C6, and C7 ventral primary rami. Suprascapular from the upper trunk. And then the only other branch that is from the supraclavicular portion of the brachial plexus is the nerve to the subclavius, and I didn't expect to see it in this dissection. It should be coming off the upper trunk, going to the subclavius muscle, which has been removed. When the middle third of the clavicle was cut out, the subclavius was removed as well, so its nerve is gone, but it would have been coming off the upper trunk. Okay, how was that?